So it's great that you're here today to present your latest research, and you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you, Ollie. Thanks a lot. And thanks for inviting me, and thanks for coming on this beautiful Friday to this talk. Hopefully it will be good enough for you. So this paper is currently under review, and it's co-authored with Pablo Fernandez-Vazquez, who is a postdoctoral scholar at the Juan March Institute since the beginning of this year, actually. But the project started actually when Pablo and I met at a conference a couple of years ago, following up our respective publications, looking at a similar question, whether voters actually update their perceptions of party positions in response to changes in parties' election manifestos. And Jumanis, Lawrence Ezro, and myself, we published this paper in 2011 in AJPS, in which the answer was no. The voters do not update their perceptions when parties change their manifestos. People do not seem to understand and change their perceptions in response. I'm going to follow up in 2014 looking at the European integration issue. The first one was on left-right scale, and we still couldn't find evidence that voters seem to update their perceptions in response to manifesto shifts of parties. Pablo published in 2014 in CPS a paper which used a different methodology, a different model to look at the same question. And he actually finds some effects of manifestos on voters' perceptions, but only marginal, very small effect actually. So we met at this conference, and we both were actually quite perplexed from this finding. By this finding, we were kind of depressed actually that the voters do not seem to understand or update their perceptions in response to changes in parties' campaign rhetoric, or more specifically in response to manifesto positions of parties. So we started talking, and we said there must be something. There must be something that voters should be taking from these manifestos. And maybe under certain conditions that effect happens. When something happens and voters seem to pay more attention to party manifestos. So around the same time, I was actually involved in data collection of leadership changes, party leadership changes across several European countries. That was my kind of personal interest since graduate school. In graduate school at UC Davis, I had the chance to work with Bob Jackman, who passed away in 2010, and Joe Andrews, who they both published a paper in 2009 in BJPS looking at when do parties change their leaders. I was an array on that project. So since then, I've been interested in trying to understand when parties change their leaders, how do they change their leaders, what are the electoral consequences of party leadership changes. And I've been collecting these leadership change data when I met with Pablo at this conference in those several countries in across Europe. So we said, maybe there's something here in terms of leadership changes. And actually, both of these papers, in Zeynep Somer-Topcu 2011 paper and also Fernandez-Vazquez paper 2014, one example that we both talked about was the British Labour Party. Okay, so the British Labour Party, of course, is very interesting because what happened in the British Labour Party was during the 1980s, as you know, at the beginning of the 1980s, they were quite leftist. In 1983, they published a manifesto which was very leftist, which was regarded as the longest suicide note in history. And from that point on, Kinnock was the leader at the time, and until 1992, when Smith became the leader, he tried to change the party's image. He tried to move the party towards more centrist position, but people didn't really understand that. People were not really following. When he changed the party's position from 1983 to 1987 election toward a more centrist position, people didn't really understand what was going on there. Okay, and then he moved a little bit back in terms of the manifesto position, and people still were not really understanding what was going on, even though they were kind of approaching to that position. Smith became leader after this election year, 1992 defeat of the Labour Party. He became the leader right after the election, but he died in office. He had a heart attack in 1994 when Tony Blair became the leader. So the first election after 1992 was Tony Blair's election in 1997. And as we know, Tony Blair, of course, the New Left idea, he changed the party's policy significantly towards center. And this time around, people followed. So what was peculiar about this? Of course, Tony Blair being a charismatic leader and changing the party's position a lot, of course people paid attention. But maybe there was something when Tony Blair became the leader, maybe there was something, and that started our discussion. And Pablo actually became a postdoctoral scholar at Vanderbilt University. So throughout that year, we continued that discussion and started thinking maybe this can be generalized to other cases across Europe. And do leadership changes matter? So that was the research question that we were focusing on: whether appointing a new leader help political parties change the attitudes and beliefs that voters have about the party. And more specifically, we were interested in whether voters understand the policy stances parties take during an election campaign following a leadership change. And we believe that today I'm going to show you that using voters' perceptions data and the data that I collected on party leadership changes, that from 7 Western European democracies, that actually they do. People seem to better understand, more accurately perceive the party's positions when there is a leadership change. And this effect is particularly strong for opposition parties, and I'll explain why in a second. And these results, we argue, we believe, have important implications. First of all, normatively. As I said, we were quite disturbed by the fact that campaigns do not seem to matter. Election manifestos do not seem to matter for voters. And if that's the case, if they don't matter, then what are we talking about here? Campaigns do not matter, then what are people voting on? They are probably choosing the wrong parties, thinking that they are closer to certain parties ideologically, but they don't know. So what are they voting on? And at the end, when politicians get to the office by the wrong mandate, they may think that they have the right mandate, but they don't. So the policies, what are the policies reflecting? What are the policies representing? So there are all these bad normative implications if people do not understand accurately what parties are proposing. But beyond that, of course, these results also have implications for that literature that I just mentioned, where myself with my co-authors couldn't find an effect of voters listening to parties, and we argue in this paper that they do actually under certain circumstances when there's a leadership change. And this is also good news for the campaign literature, probably. As you know, it's very contentious literature. Some people argue that campaigns do not matter, others say campaigns do matter. So we contribute to that literature by saying they matter under certain circumstances. And in terms of party organizational changes, we are focusing on leadership changes specifically, but hopefully these results can also generate additional research or lead to additional research looking at other party organizational features and how they affect perceptions in the future. Okay, so let's start with the theory, whether voters listen to what parties say and why. As I mentioned a couple times so far, existing evidence says no, or limited effect of parties and the election manifestos on voters' positions. And we argue that there are at least 2 potential reasons for why voters may be not listening to political parties. And these are as follows, that first of all, election manifestos are noisy signals. As we know from a growing literature, manifestos only give some sort of noisy signal to voters. And so that may be one of the reasons why voters do not listen to what parties say. And voters may be skeptical, related to the first point. Voters may be skeptical of party rhetoric and discount campaign policy messages as not credible. The existing literature suggests that what matters for voters' perceptions of party positions, it's not so much the campaign rhetoric of the parties, but it's the actions of parties in office. Right, so there's this literature, examples are Fortunato and Stevenson and Bernavitsky, who show that party action in office, like in the parliament or their coalition politics, those are the things that matter when it comes to voters perceiving where the parties are located. Not so much the campaign rhetoric or what parties promise that they would do. People take them with a salt of grain in that sense, that people do not really find those promises credible at the end. And that may be the reason why we are not seeing party manifestos making a difference. But maybe under certain circumstances, they find them more credible. And we argue that leadership changes actually provide credibility to the policy stances or policy rhetoric of political parties. Parties can reduce voter skepticism towards their policy rhetoric and increase the credibility of their campaign promises if they have a new leader in office. Okay, so that's our main argument here. Yes?
So you explained that by credibility, but what about the media coverage? Because I guess when you have a leadership change, you have a lot of media coverage really focused just on that party at that time.
Yes,
so
exactly.
Can it matter?
It definitely does matter, and actually it's kind of an assumption we take for granted in this work that the media attention increases, and that can be a different mechanism to explain our findings, but we don't have data to test it. So originally, actually, when we wrote this paper, we said there are two mechanisms to explain these findings, one of them being the media coverage increases. But media coverage increase doesn't on its own create the credibility of the party promises. If people do not believe in what parties are saying, even though they hear it, they don't update their perceptions of the party position. They only update their perceptions if they hear about it and they find them credible, right? And we take it kind of given that the media attention to leadership changes actually increases after a leadership change. But that's it. As I will show you at the very end of this presentation, that's a question that needs to be empirically analyzed. We don't have data to test that. Okay, so the thing is though, some people may say, well, Tony Blair came in and changed the party's position tremendously to the center, new left, got a lot of attention from that policy shift. So maybe it's the policy shift that matters, and not so much the leadership change that matters, and primes voters about parties' positions and educates them. But no, actually, we argue that this effect works regardless of how much the party changes its policy position. It's the leadership change that matters, and not so much the policy change. We argue that if the leader comes in and changes the party's position, that's good. That gives credibility in the following sense. People would not evaluate the new leader as a flip-flopper, right? They don't have the previous point of view of the leader's position. They only know what the party has been doing under the old leader. So when the new leader comes and changes the party's position tremendously, people don't say, oh, well, he's being opportunistic, or, well, he's being flip-flopper. People find that change more credible, given that, okay, it's a new leader and the change is happening obviously because it's a new leader, right? So in that sense, credibility increases, and people find it more reasonable and update their perceptions and more accurately perceive the party's positions. But in some instances, a leader comes in and doesn't change the party's position. John Major, for instance, took over from Margaret Thatcher and pretty much continued the party as is without changing the party's policy position. For several reasons that can be happening for several reasons. It may be that the leader might be just, having the same kind of ideas about what the best policies are, or there can be a divided party that wouldn't allow the party to change the party position. But regardless, let's say the party's promises doesn't change, still we argue that a new leader brings more attention and more credibility to the existing party's position. The leader didn't defect on the previous position of the party. The new leader is a newly coming new brand manager coming in and taking over the existing party, presenting the same policies, but making them more credible in that sense. So regardless of the policy change, we expect more credibility attributed to the party's position with a new leader. And hence our first hypothesis is that with new party leaders, voters are more likely to perceive the party positions in line with the public stances taken by the party. So more accurately perceive the party's position in that sense. But we also argue that this effect should be especially strong for opposition parties. And this goes back to my own research with Kathleen Baum. In 2012, we published this article in which we show that voters heavily discount the campaign policy pledges of incumbent political parties. And this is a kind of obvious point, but just to reiterate, governing parties are often evaluated by their performance in office, right? Rather than what they promised during the election campaigns. Their positions are usually perceived based on their actions in office, not so much their campaign promises. Opposition parties, on the other hand, mainly rely on their campaign rhetoric to redefine their policy image during the elections. And hence, when a new leader comes in, and we are thinking about how manifestos, campaign rhetoric affects voters' perceptions, the effect should be stronger for opposition parties, for which the perceptions are not kind of muddled by all that information that comes from being in office. For governing parties, on the other hand, people will not more accurately perceive the party's position necessarily. They will instead use their actions in office to understand the party's position rather than their campaign rhetoric. So the second hypothesis then is that voters' perceptions of party positions are more in line with the opposition party's policy positions following a leadership change compared to those of governing parties. So we are hoping to find more effect, more stronger effect for opposition parties than governing parties. So to test these hypotheses, our dependent variable is voters' perceptions of party left-right positions. For this, we collected national election surveys where voters are asked to locate parties on the left-right scale. And we standardize these scales to be from 0 to 10. And what we are using is we are using the average perceived position of each party by all respondents to the surveys. Okay. So we are not doing an individual level analysis here, so that's something that we are thinking about doing next. And the main reason for not doing individual level analysis in a multi-level setting is because our data is not only from CSES, but also from individual national election surveys, and it's very hard, if not impossible, to merge all those national election surveys together with the same kind of demographic questions which we need to control for with an individual level data. So right now we are just using the average perceived left-right position of the parties as our dependent variable. The main independent variables, obviously, party manifesto left-right position is what we are using to look at how the manifesto positions affect voters' perceptions. We are using the comparative manifesto project's left-right scale positions for this, but we are not using the usual -100 to +100 original scale, but we are using Low et al. Scaling, which takes the log of the ratio of left-right sentences, and then we rescale those log ratios to 0 to 10 scale as well. We replicated our analyses using the original -100 to +100 manifesto data locations, and those do not change the results. Leadership change, as I said, I collected these data for the past several years actually, using Kiesing's word archives, secondary literature, and newspaper archives. What I did was I hired 3 students at Vanderbilt, undergraduates, and they coded all the leadership changes, and not only whether there was a leadership change or not, but also what was the reason for resignation, how did the new selection of the new leader work, whether there was an election, if there was an election, how many candidates ran in how many rounds, what was the competition, if it was behind the closed doors, whether there was any leaked information to the public about the election and selection of the leadership, of the new leader. So all these data, 3 undergrads at Vanderbilt coded the data. Of course, they could only use English sources, so there were a lot of things to be filled in. So what I did, I hired master's students in every single European country to fill in the blanks for the rest of the data. So I have a quite extensive data which I'm hoping to use to explain more like when do leadership changes happen and what are the consequences of them in the near future. But for now, we are just using leadership change as a dummy variable. And it will be interesting to look at whether differences in terms of different leadership changes and different leadership styles, whether that makes a difference in terms of perceptions. Yes?
Yeah, and actually that's a bit related to that, because I mean there is potentially here an endogeneity problem where the leadership may change because voter perception has changed.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have a lot of leadership changes that are either on a regular basis where basically it's fixed, it's expected she does,
Yeah.
or a bit like the example you gave, a leader that dies or something like that, and that must be changed
Yeah.
in an exogenous way?
No, absolutely. I didn't think about it in this context, but in a different paper, which I'm going to present at the European Political Science Association conference in June, I'm looking at the consequences of leadership changes for election outcomes. But of course, there's a big endogeneity problem. Leadership changes happen usually after a dip in popular support for the party. But the thing is, with the coding that I have, since I have all the resignation reasons as not only stated by the leader himself or herself, but also the actual resignation reason coded from the newspaper coverage. I can actually separate those exogenous and endogenous leadership changes. John Smith's death is not an exogenous case, unfortunately. Even though he died from a heart attack, he actually announced in advance that he would resign as the leader, so that's not an exogenous. Or like, there was another example. What was the, blanking right now. What was the name of the Swedish, Olof Palme? Olof Palme was killed, and he died in office, but it was an assassination, so can we consider it as an exogenous or not, right? So it's very tricky to separate those, but that's something I'm working on differently. Yeah, I think that's very interesting. Okay, so for now though, we are just using 0-1. If there was a leadership change prior to the election campaign, then we are coding it as 1. If not, as then it's 0. There are other variables to test the hypothesis. Obviously, we need an interaction of leadership change with the manifesto left-right position. So we have that in the paper. We expect a positive coefficient for this interaction variable. We also have a lagged perceived party position. This is at the levels as well in the data in the model. And we also interact this with the leadership change. Here the expectation is that when there's a leadership change, the effect of lagged perceived party position should go down, and the effect of manifesto should go up. So in this, we expect a negative coefficient for this interaction and a positive coefficient for our main interaction variable. To test the second hypothesis about governing versus opposition parties, we use data from the European Representative Democracy Data Archive, and in the paper itself, you operationalize governing parties as 1 if a party was ever in the government during the inter-election period. Of course, there may be government changes in between 2 elections. If the party was ever in government, we code it as 1 here. But in the supplementary document, we also test the model by looking at the very last government only, in a more restrictive sense. Okay, so these are the countries and years under analysis. The years are mainly determined by the availability of the national election survey data in which voters are asked to locate parties on the left-right scale. We are focusing solely on post-election surveys here. And we collected the leadership data based on the availability of the survey data in that sense. Okay, so we use OLS regression with country fixed effects. And here are the results. These are all parties. Okay. So here the baseline model, it doesn't have the leadership change at all. So this is consistent with the previous finding that Pablo Fernandez-Vazquez published in CPS 2014. Very weak, statistically significant, but very weak effect of the election manifesto on voters' perception. Again, the dependent variable is from 0 to 10 scale. So this basically says, if the party changes the effect is very small. If the party changes its position 1 unit on the 0 to 10 scale, it's only 0.08 is what the change is happening. So this is very consistent with what Pablo published in that CPS article, very weak effect of manifesto. And what is really driving the perceptions is the previous perceptions, right? It's almost 1-to-1 relationship. Although there is no unit root, we tested for unit root, there is no unit root here. In terms of leadership change, so here is our main hypothesis, interaction between platform and leadership change and perception and leadership change. These are in the expected direction, plus and minus, but not statistically significant. So as we said, these effects should be stronger for opposition parties, and that's what we find here if you look at the separate effects for government and opposition parties. Without a leader change, platform has no effect. 0. Okay. But when there's a leadership change, the effect is 0.2. Still not that big, right? We acknowledge the fact that we are not talking about 1-to-1 perception. Suddenly, people completely understand where the party is located. But it's much better than what we have been trying to show in the literature without any effects. And perceptions interaction is negative, so the perceptions become less important when there's a leadership change. While the platform becomes more important. So let's look at the effect is strong and significant only for opposition parties. So let's look at the marginal effects here. So these are only for opposition parties. Here we see that the lag perceptions, even though it was like 1-to-1 when there was no leadership change, when there's a leadership change, the effect of previous perception lessens, even though it's still the driving force for the most part in terms of the voters' perceptions. But in terms of manifesto positions, how they affect the perceptions, it was 0 when there was no leadership change. And now it actually makes a difference. How much of a difference? Let's look at the kind of the long-term simulation that we did here. And this is kind of an extreme case, but let's say a party was located at 0, okay? And hence here, 0. Let's say the party was located at 0. And suddenly for this election, the party decides to take a position at 6. Huge jump. Then in this election, it's 6. And then voters' perceptions actually change towards 6. They are now at around 1.2. Okay, if the party jumps from 0 to 6, the perception changes from 0 to 1.2 or something in the current election. Still not, perfectly accurately perceiving the party position, but compared to when there was no leadership change, at least they are paying some attention. Some people are paying some attention to the party's position, right? The average perceived position adjusts towards where the party is located. But this effect is only relevant for the first election. If the party continues to stay at the position of 6, but no leadership change afterwards, then this stabilizes and no further change. The only change happens right after the leadership change happens. Okay. And that's what we were trying to explain here. Of course, we need to rule out other explanations here as well. As I said, some people may argue, well, it's not so much the leadership change, but it's the policy change that matters. Okay, so Tony Blair came in and changed the perceptions. It's not because of Tony Blair per se, it's because of the party's position change. So we looked at the position shifts of parties after a leadership change happens versus no leadership change happens. And the data actually is very interesting because starting this project, or the leadership change project actually from the get-go, I was thinking that when there's a leadership change, there is a significant policy change in the party, but that's not the case. In fact, the parties, there's no difference, no significant difference, but the new leader has even less change compared to the same leader in terms of party policy shift. So it's not the party policy shift that explains these results, it's the leadership change.
What are these numbers referring to? So 0.75, that's a shift to the right?
I believe, yes.
So on average, all parties shift to the right. I mean, does that make sense?
This may be the magnitude, the absolute shift.
Is it absolute?
I can't say. I need to check that back. Yeah. I mean, it makes more sense if it's absolute, right? Yeah. That's it. Yeah. I'll check that. The second potential reason why we might be seeing these effects, and one of the reviewers from the original submission, which got rejected, said was that maybe the party became much more clear in its position under a new leader. The previous leader was kind of mudding the position or making it more ambiguous. So maybe we have a clearer position under the new leader. So looking at the standard error of platform positions, we actually see that actually the standard error of platform positions do not change between the same leader and the new leader either. So there's no such a significant difference there either. So this is like a crude attack to that point, but we don't see this happening either in data. We also did several alternative robustness tests for the models that we are running here. We use alternative definition of incumbency status, as I explained before. All our niche parties in our data are in opposition, so we said maybe they are driving the results of the opposition parties since they are peculiar on their own. We dropped the niche parties from the analysis, but still we got the same results. And we also check whether the timing of the leadership change matters. For our theory, actually, it doesn't matter when the leadership change happens within the election period. The voters just realize there's a new leader, and the campaign promises, they find that more credible. And indeed, if you look at the timing in office for the new leader, it doesn't seem to matter as well whether the leadership change happens right after the previous election or right before the upcoming election. Doesn't make a difference. So to conclude, today I showed you that voters perceive party manifesto positions more accurately when there's a leadership change, and the effect is particularly relevant for opposition parties. And as I mentioned, these have implications for our understanding of the dynamics of party competition, voter perceptions, campaign effects, and hopefully some good news for democratic representation. But of course, there are some questions that are left open, and we need to close them later. One of them is, of course, manifestos are only a part of the campaign, right? Here we are making an assumption that manifestos are the campaign rhetoric of political parties, but parties may have other, they may change their manifesto positions. There may be events that force them to change their positions from the manifesto. So, without really looking at their campaign rhetoric per se, it's not really possible to argue that campaigns make a difference. What we found is that manifestos make a difference. But in that sense, our results are conservative in that sense. So hopefully, once we have the data which we are collecting for the campaign coverage, we'll find stronger effects. Our data come from 7 countries, which some people may say, well, how generalizable are these results? But these are all parliamentary systems with strong parties. So hopefully we can say that they can generalize to other parliamentary systems with strong parties. Potential other mechanism that voters hear more about the party, potentially explaining these findings, which we don't have the data to empirically test, but something that we are looking forward to, looking at whether media coverage increases following a leadership change, and the extent to which the media coverage increases, whether it makes a difference at the end. Yeah,
Can you just name the 7 countries again, please?
Oh yeah, Denmark, Germany, Great Britain, Norway, Netherlands, Sweden, Spain. Individual level understanding of how parties shape voter perception, as I said, it's hard to merge the data, but that's we can still do with the CSDS data to look at whether individual level differences make a difference here. And some may argue that more knowledgeable, more politically interested people probably perceive the parties more accurately following a leadership change compared to less knowledgeable, less interested people. So that's something we don't test here that we can look at later. And as I said, I collected the data on leadership changes, the resignation reasons, and also the selection process. Do they make a difference? Whether the election was competitive or not, or whether the person was appointed by the previous leader or by a committee behind the closed doors. Do they make a difference in terms of voters' perceptions or finding the leader a credible actor? So that's something we can test in the future as well. And of course, there are other intra-party factors that I'm hoping that some other people can test. I don't have data for these, but party cohesion, factionalism, they may also affect voters' perception. So that's still await scholarly attention in that sense. So thank you.